The last person Ethan Walker expected to find inside his house was a woman worth hundreds of millions of dollars, standing in his kitchen with a mop in her hands and tears in her eyes. But that impossible moment was still hours away. On that cold Thursday morning, Ethan's biggest concern was whether he could stretch the groceries in his truck bed through the weekend. The 42-year-old single father parked his aging Ford pickup truck outside a small grocery store on the edge of town and checked the numbers on his phone one more time. Rent was paid. The utility bill was due next week. His son's school field trip fee was still sitting unpaid in the corner of his mind. He sighed quietly and slid the phone back into his pocket. Worry never solved anything. Work usually did. Inside the store, Ethan filled his cart with practical items: bread, eggs, pasta, generic cereal. He compared prices carefully, not because he was bitter about money, but because responsibility required attention. As he reached for the last gallon of milk, he noticed an elderly woman struggling to lift a case of bottled water into her cart. Without hesitation, he stepped forward. "Let me help with that, ma'am." The woman smiled with relief. "Thank you, dear." Ethan carried the water to her car and returned to finish his shopping. He never noticed someone watching from several rows away. A woman in a navy wool coat stood quietly near the produce section. She had the polished appearance of someone who belonged in executive boardrooms rather than neighborhood grocery stores. Yet her attention remained fixed on Ethan, not because of what he looked like, because of what he did when nobody seemed to be paying attention. By noon, Ethan was at work repairing maintenance issues for a local housing nonprofit. The job was not glamorous, but it mattered. He spent the afternoon replacing a broken handrail outside an apartment building where several senior citizens lived. One resident offered him $20 as a thank you. Ethan smiled and politely refused. "The nonprofit already pays me. Keep it for something you need." The old man shook his head in disbelief as Ethan returned to work. Across town, life looked very different for Charlotte Bennett. As chief executive officer of one of the region's largest healthcare technology companies, her days were usually measured in meetings, deadlines, and difficult decisions. Yet she found herself distracted. Earlier that morning, she had once again crossed paths with the same man she had quietly observed several times over the past month. The single father at the grocery store. The maintenance worker who always volunteered extra hours at community events. The man who somehow reminded her of someone she had lost. Late that afternoon, Charlotte sat alone in her office overlooking downtown Columbus. A thick folder rested on her desk. Inside were reports, schedules, financial forecasts, and one handwritten note she carried everywhere. She opened it slowly. The paper was worn at the edges from years of folding and unfolding. Her eyes filled with emotion as she reread the words. Then her assistant knocked on the door. "Your board meeting starts in 10 minutes. Charlotte nodded, but her attention remained on the note, because the handwriting on that page belonged to someone connected to Ethan Walker in a way he could never imagine. Hours later, after finishing another long shift, Ethan stopped by his mailbox, grabbed a stack of bills, and headed home through the fading autumn light. He expected an empty house, a simple dinner, and an evening helping his son with homework. Instead, as he pulled into his driveway, he noticed an unfamiliar luxury SUV parked beside the porch. The front door was slightly open, and somewhere inside his house, someone was cleaning. For several seconds, Ethan Walker remained seated inside his pickup truck, staring at the unfamiliar SUV parked beside his modest home. The engine ticked softly as it cooled. The porch light glowed against the gathering dusk. Through the front window, he could see movement. Someone was inside. His first thought was not fear. It was confusion. He climbed out, grocery bags hanging from both hands, and walked carefully toward the house. The front door opened before he reached it. Standing in the doorway was a woman he recognized immediately from the grocery store. The same woman in the navy coat. The same woman who carried herself with quiet authority. But now she wore rolled-up sleeves, cleaning gloves, and an expression that looked almost nervous. Ethan stopped. So did she. For a moment, neither spoke. Then Charlotte Bennett removed one glove and offered a small, uncertain smile. "Mr. Walker, I realize this looks strange." Ethan glanced past her shoulder. The The living room was cleaner than he had left it that morning. Dusty shelves had been wiped down. The old coffee table had been polished. Even the stack of unopened mail near the kitchen counter had been neatly organized. "Strange is one word for it," he said gently. There was no anger in his voice, only honest bewilderment. Charlotte looked relieved by his calm reaction. Most people would have demanded explanations. Ethan simply waited. "I should probably start at the beginning," she said. Before she could continue, footsteps echoed from the hallway. Ethan's 12-year-old son, Caleb, appeared carrying a box of old books. His face lit up when he saw his father. "Dad, she's been helping all afternoon." Ethan set the grocery bags on the counter and looked between them. "Helping with what?" Caleb hesitated. Charlotte lowered her eyes. The answer was suddenly more complicated than either of them wanted. An hour later, the three sat around the small kitchen table. Outside, autumn leaves scraped softly across the driveway. The utility bill remained visible beneath a magnet on the refrigerator door. The scent of fresh coffee filled the room. Charlotte explained that she had come to town for business several weeks earlier. During that time, she repeatedly noticed Ethan helping people. At the grocery store, at community events, around the housing nonprofit. She never introduced herself. She simply observed. Ethan listened politely, though none of it explained why a CEO was sitting in his kitchen. "I appreciate the kind words," he said carefully. "But that still does not explain why you clean my house." Charlotte wrapped both hands around her coffee mug. For the first time since arriving, she seemed unsure of herself. "Because I owed someone a debt," she said quietly. Ethan frowned. "Someone I know?" Charlotte looked toward a worn bookshelf in the corner of the room. Her eyes lingered there for several seconds. Then she asked a question that changed everything. "Did you ever know a man named Daniel Bennett?" The room fell silent. Ethan's expression shifted immediately. Surprise, recognition, memory. Daniel Bennett was a name he had not heard in nearly 15 years. Back when life looked very different. Back before he became a single father. Back before loss taught him how fragile everything could be. Charlotte noticed the change in his face. Her eyes filled with emotion. Because for the first time, she knew she had finally found the right person. Ethan leaned back slowly in his chair. "Daniel was my friend," he said. Charlotte nodded. A tear slipped down her cheek before she could stop it. "He was my older brother." Ethan stared at her, speechless. And what Charlotte revealed next would uncover a secret neither of them had been prepared to face. For several moments, nobody moved. The kitchen clock ticked softly above the refrigerator while Ethan stared at Charlotte Bennett in disbelief. 15 years seemed to collapse into a single breath. Daniel Bennett. The name carried memories of long conversations, shared dreams, and a friendship formed during a difficult chapter of life. Ethan looked down at the coffee mug in his hands. "I've not heard that name in a very long time," he said quietly. Charlotte nodded. Her eyes remained fixed on him. "Neither had I until a few months ago." Caleb glanced between them, sensing that something important was unfolding. Outside the window, the last traces of daylight disappeared behind bare trees. The small house felt suddenly crowded with memories. Charlotte reached into her handbag and carefully removed a worn envelope. The paper looked old, folded and unfolded countless times over the years. "My brother wrote this before he passed away," she said. Ethan's expression softened immediately. Daniel had died unexpectedly years earlier. Ethan remembered the funeral. He remembered the grief. He remembered wishing he could have done more. Charlotte placed the envelope on the kitchen table. "I found it while cleaning out my mother's attic after she moved into assisted living." Ethan remained silent as she continued. Inside was a letter. Most of it was addressed to me, but there was one section about a man named Ethan Walker. The room grew quiet again. Caleb leaned forward slightly. Charlotte swallowed hard before continuing. "Daniel wrote that when he was struggling financially and emotionally, there was one person who never treated him like a burden." Ethan lowered his eyes. Across the room, the utility bill on the refrigerator suddenly seemed unimportant. Charlotte continued, reading from memory. "He wrote that you loaned him money when you barely had any yourself. You drove him to job interviews in your old truck. You helped him move apartments. You sat with him in a hospital waiting room when nobody else came." Ethan shifted uncomfortably. Daniel was my friend. Charlotte smiled sadly. That is exactly what he wrote. He said you never acted like you were doing anything special. The words hung in the air. 4 years Charlotte had built a life around achievement, performance, and measurable success. Yet the deeper she read Daniel's letter, the more she realized that the person her brother admired most had been a man with almost nothing except character. The following afternoon, Ethan returned to work at the housing nonprofit. The conversation with Charlotte remained on his mind, though he tried not to dwell on it. He spent the morning repairing a leaking faucet in an apartment occupied by a disabled veteran. Before leaving, he noticed the man's pantry was nearly empty. On his lunch break, Ethan stopped at a grocery store and quietly purchased several bags of food. He left them outside the apartment door without mentioning it. Meanwhile, Charlotte found herself unable to focus during meetings. She sat in a glass conference room surrounded by executives discussing quarterly projections. Yet her thoughts kept returning to Ethan's kitchen table, to the utility bill, to the modest house, to the fact that the same man who had once helped her brother was still helping people every single day. Late that evening, she drove past Ethan's neighborhood again, not because she planned to stop, just because she wanted to understand. As she slowed near his mailbox, she noticed something through the front window. Ethan and Caleb were sitting together at the dining table, helping each other with homework. The scene was ordinary, yet something about it felt more meaningful than any board meeting she had attended all year. Charlotte remained parked for several moments before finally driving away. But one question refused to leave her mind. If Ethan had done so much for Daniel, why had he never told anyone? And the answer waiting inside Daniel's letter would change everything she thought she knew about him. 3 days later, Ethan Walker found himself thinking about Daniel Bennett more than he had in years. The memories arrived unexpectedly while he worked, appearing between ordinary tasks and quiet moments. One minute, he was repairing a broken porch step for the housing nonprofit. The next, he was remembering late-night conversations with a struggling friend who had once believed his life was falling apart. Daniel had never been easy to help because he hated feeling dependent on anyone. Ethan understood that feeling. Maybe that was why they became friends. On Saturday morning, Ethan and Caleb stopped at a small diner after a volunteer project at a church parking lot. The waitress greeted them by name and refilled their coffee and hot chocolate without being asked. Caleb talked excitedly about an upcoming science competition while Ethan listened attentively. Halfway through breakfast, the bell above the diner door chimed. Ethan glanced up and froze. Charlotte Bennett had just walked inside. She looked slightly surprised to see them too. For a moment, neither moved. Then Ethan stood and offered a polite smile. "Good morning." Charlotte returned the smile, though there was something different in her expression now. Less curiosity, more respect. She joined them for coffee, and the conversation flowed more naturally than either expected. Caleb quickly warmed to her. Within minutes, he was enthusiastically explaining his science project using sugar packets and napkin sketches. Charlotte laughed more during that breakfast than she had during most of the previous month. Yet beneath the pleasant conversation, she carried a growing burden. Daniel's letter contained details she still had not shared. Details that made Ethan's kindness seem even more extraordinary. Later that afternoon, Charlotte visited a storage facility on the edge of Columbus. Inside one of the units sat dozens of boxes containing her family's old belongings. Dust floated through narrow beams of sunlight as she searched through papers, photographs, and journals. Eventually, she found what she had been looking for. A second envelope tucked inside a worn photo album. This one was addressed directly to Ethan Walker. Her hands trembled slightly as she opened it. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the afternoon helping a neighbor repair a damaged fence before heading home to sort through paperwork at the kitchen table. Bills were stacked neatly beside him. The utility bill remained unpaid but manageable. Caleb worked on homework nearby. Life felt ordinary again, yet he could not shake the feeling that Charlotte's appearance had disrupted something long buried beneath the surface of his life. That evening, Charlotte drove to Ethan's house. The old pickup truck sat in the driveway. Warm light glowed through the living room window. She remained in her SUV for several minutes, staring at the envelope resting on the passenger seat. Eventually, she walked to the front door. Ethan welcomed her inside. Caleb politely excused himself and headed upstairs, sensing they needed privacy. Charlotte sat at the kitchen table where their first serious conversation had taken place. She placed the envelope between them. Ethan looked at the familiar handwriting and immediately recognized it. Daniel's. His chest tightened. I did not know this existed, he said quietly. Charlotte nodded. Neither did I. Ethan carefully unfolded the letter. As he began reading, the room fell silent except for the distant hum of the refrigerator. The first few lines made him smile. Then his expression changed. Slowly, completely, because Daniel was revealing a truth Ethan had never known. A truth about something that happened years ago in a hospital waiting room that connected all three of their lives in a way neither Ethan nor Charlotte had ever imagined. And by the time he reached the final paragraph, everything between them was about to change. The letter trembled slightly in Ethan Walker's hands as he continued reading. The familiar handwriting pulled him backward through years he had not revisited in a long time. Across the kitchen table, Charlotte Bennett watched quietly. The old refrigerator hummed in the background. Upstairs, Caleb's bedroom door closed softly as he settled in for the evening. Everything felt ordinary except for the words unfolding on the page. Daniel's letter described a winter night 15 years earlier. Charlotte had been 23 years old and recovering from a serious medical emergency. Their family was overwhelmed by expenses. Insurance delays had created financial pressure. Fear hung over every conversation. Daniel wrote about sitting alone in a hospital waiting room, wondering how he would help his younger sister keep her apartment while paying medical bills. Ethan remembered that night immediately. He remembered Daniel's exhaustion. He remembered the vending machine coffee. He remembered the silence. What he did not remember was telling anyone about the envelope he had slipped into Daniel's coat pocket before leaving. Ethan reached the final page and stopped. His eyes widened. Charlotte quietly finished the sentence he was reading. You gave him $5,000. Ethan stared at her. I told him not to mention it. Charlotte nodded. He obeyed. The room fell silent. Years earlier, $5,000 had represented nearly everything Ethan had managed to save. Money intended for his future. Money he could barely afford to part with. Yet he had never considered it a sacrifice worth discussing. Daniel needed help. That was the entire calculation. Charlotte's voice cracked slightly. That money kept me in my apartment while I recovered. It gave me time to finish graduate school. It kept me from dropping out. Ethan looked down at the table. He seemed almost uncomfortable hearing the impact of his own actions. Daniel paid me back eventually. Charlotte shook her head. That is not what mattered. For the first time, Ethan understood why she had appeared in his house with cleaning supplies, why she had been watching him, why she carried Daniel's letter everywhere. It was not about repayment. It was gratitude that had waited 15 years for a destination. The emotional shift between them changed something fundamental. Charlotte no longer saw Ethan as a kind stranger. She saw the invisible foundation beneath a portion of her own success. Yet a new complication emerged almost immediately. The following week, Ethan received difficult news at work. Funding cuts were forcing the housing nonprofit to eliminate positions. His supervisor called him into a small office overlooking the parking lot. The conversation was respectful but unavoidable. His hours would be reduced significantly beginning next month. Ethan accepted the news with the same calm dignity he brought to everything else. He thanked his supervisor for being honest and returned to work. But later, sitting alone inside his pickup truck, he stared at the numbers on a notepad. Reduced income, existing bills, Caleb's growing needs. The math was not encouraging. That evening, Charlotte stopped by unexpectedly after work. She found Ethan repairing a loose porch railing beneath the fading light. He smiled and greeted her warmly, never mentioning the news. But she noticed something different, a quiet heaviness. During dinner, Caleb innocently mentioned the changes of the nonprofit. The conversation stopped. Charlotte looked at Ethan. Ethan simply shrugged. We will figure out. No bitterness. No self-pity. Just responsibility. Later, as Charlotte drove home through the autumn darkness, she made a decision. For years, she had searched for a way to honor what Ethan had done for her family. Now an opportunity stood directly in front of her. Yet she also knew Ethan's pride was rooted in dignity, not ego. Any attempt to help him would have to respect the very qualities she admired most. And the plan she began developing that night would soon test both of their hearts in ways neither expected. Charlotte Bennett spent the next several days thinking carefully about what respect actually looked like. Money could solve many problems, but she had learned enough about Ethan Walker to know that writing a check would accomplish the wrong thing. He had spent his entire life helping people without expecting rewards. If she approached him as a charity case, she would damage the very dignity she admired. So instead of asking how she could rescue him, she began asking how she could honor him. On Tuesday evening, she invited Ethan and Caleb to dinner at a small diner halfway between Columbus and their town. The familiar smell of coffee, grilled burgers, and fresh pie filled the room. Caleb immediately became distracted by a towering slice of chocolate cake in the display case, while Ethan smiled apologetically. Charlotte laughed. The evening felt surprisingly comfortable. For the first time, the conversation moved beyond Daniel, beyond old letters, and beyond gratitude. They talked about community projects, parenting, and the strange ways life changes people. Charlotte noticed how Ethan always listened before speaking, how he never tried to impress anyone, how his attention naturally shifted toward whoever needed encouragement. Halfway through dinner, Caleb excused himself to use the restroom. Charlotte finally shared an idea she had been considering. Her company was launching a new community outreach initiative focused on affordable housing partnerships. They needed someone who understood people, not just budgets. Someone trusted by local families. Ethan immediately shook his head. "I'm not an executive." Charlotte smiled. "That is exactly why I thought of you." Ethan looked down at his coffee cup. The possibility made him uncomfortable. Not because he lacked ability, but because he genuinely believed others were more qualified. The conversation ended without a decision. The following afternoon, Ethan stopped by a grocery store after work. As he loaded bags into his pickup truck, he noticed a young mother struggling to calm two exhausted children while carrying groceries. Without hesitation, he offered to help load her car. The interaction lasted less than 2 minutes. By the time he returned to his truck, the woman was smiling with relief. Ethan drove away without expecting gratitude. What he did not realize was that Charlotte had witnessed the entire exchange from across the parking lot. It was another small reminder of why she believed in him. Days later, she arranged for Ethan to visit one of her company's community development meetings. The conference room overlooked downtown Columbus, filled with charts, proposals, and executives in tailored suits. Ethan arrived wearing his usual work clothes after finishing a maintenance shift. At first, he seemed out of place. Then the discussion began. Within minutes, something unexpected happened. While others focused on numbers and projections, Ethan focused on people. He spoke about struggling families, elderly tenants, and practical challenges that never appeared on spreadsheets. The room grew quiet. Several executives began taking notes. Charlotte watched carefully. For the first time, she saw Ethan recognize his own value. Not because anyone praised him, because his experience genuinely mattered. Yet not everyone welcomed the idea. After the meeting, one senior executive privately questioned Charlotte's interest in someone with no corporate background. The criticism was polite but unmistakable. Charlotte defended Ethan without hesitation, but the conversation revealed a new obstacle standing between them and the future she envisioned. Later that evening, Ethan returned home and found a letter waiting beside the mailbox. It contained an invitation to interview for the community outreach position. He stared at it for a long time before carrying it inside. Upstairs, Kayla was excited. Charlotte was hopeful, but Ethan remained uncertain, because accepting the opportunity would require him to step into a world where he had never believed he belonged. And the choice waiting ahead would test far more than his professional confidence. The interview invitation remained on Ethan Walker's kitchen table for 2 days before he finally opened it. Every time he passed it, he found another reason to wait. There was laundry to finish, repairs to make, homework to review with Caleb. The truth was simpler. He was afraid of stepping into a world that seemed designed for people very different from him. On Thursday evening, Caleb finally picked up the envelope and placed it directly in front of his father. "Dad, if you tell me not to quit before a science competition, then you cannot quit before an interview." Ethan laughed despite himself. The boy had inherited his mother's ability to deliver uncomfortable truths with perfect timing. Later that night, after paying bills at the kitchen table, Ethan stared at the utility bill, then at the invitation. He thought about responsibility. He thought about providing stability for Caleb. Most of all, he thought about whether refusing the opportunity would really be humility or simply fear disguised as humility. The next morning, he called Charlotte and accepted the interview. Her relief was impossible to hide. "Good," she said. "Now promise me one thing." Ethan smiled. "What?" "Be yourself." The interview was scheduled for the following week at company headquarters in Columbus. In the days leading up to it, Ethan continued his normal routine. He repaired apartments, helped residents, stopped at the grocery store after work, volunteered at a church parking lot food drive on Saturday morning. Nothing about his behavior changed because of the opportunity ahead. If anything, he seemed more focused on helping others than ever. Charlotte noticed. So did several employees who had met him during the community development meeting. Yet not everyone shared her enthusiasm. The executive who had questioned Ethan's qualifications continued raising concerns privately. He argued that community outreach required professional credentials, not life experience. Charlotte listened respectfully, but refused to retreat. The disagreement remained professional, though it revealed a growing divide inside the company. By interview day, autumn rain covered the city. Ethan arrived wearing the best clothes he owned. A clean button-down shirt, dark slacks, and a jacket Caleb insisted made him look important. Standing in the lobby beneath polished glass walls, Ethan felt more out of place than he had in years. Around him, employees hurried between meetings carrying laptops and presentation materials. Yet the moment the interview began, something shifted. The panel asked questions about housing challenges, community trust, and family needs. Ethan answered honestly. He spoke about elderly tenants choosing between medicine and groceries. He spoke about single parents balancing work and childcare. He spoke about dignity, not as a concept, but as something people deserved regardless of circumstance. The room grew quiet. Several interviewers stopped taking notes and simply listened. Afterward, Ethan drove home in his pickup truck feeling surprisingly peaceful. He had no idea whether he would receive the position, but for the first time, he knew he had shown up as himself. That evening, Charlotte called. Her voice sounded different. Concerned. "There is something you should know," she said. The board had learned she was personally advocating for Ethan. Some members questioned her judgment. Others believed she was allowing a personal connection to influence company decisions. The criticism was becoming louder. Ethan listened carefully. Then he answered in the same calm tone he always used. "If supporting me creates problems for you, do what is best for the company." Charlotte closed her eyes. That response somehow made everything harder, because once again, Ethan was thinking about someone else before himself. But neither of them realized how serious the situation was becoming. And within days, a decision made behind closed boardroom doors would threaten to erase everything they had worked toward together. The decision came on a rainy Tuesday morning. Charlotte Bennett sat at the long conference table overlooking downtown Columbus, while members of the board reviewed final recommendations for the new community outreach position. She already knew the discussion would be difficult. What she did not expect was how quickly it would turn against Ethan Walker. Several members praised his interview. Others acknowledged his experience working directly with struggling families. Yet the same objections surfaced again and again. No corporate background, no executive experience, no formal credentials that matched the role. By the end of the meeting, the board voted to suspend the hiring process entirely. Charlotte remained composed as the decision was announced, but inside she felt something sink. The position was effectively gone, not because Ethan lacked ability, because people could not see beyond his resume. Across town, Ethan was replacing damaged flooring in an apartment unit for the housing nonprofit when Charlotte called. The sound of power tools echoed in the background as he stepped into the hallway to answer. He listened quietly while she explained what had happened. There was a long pause. Then he thanked her for trying. Nothing more. No frustration. No blame. No resentment. Charlotte closed her eyes. Somehow his grace made the disappointment hurt even more. That evening, Ethan stopped at a grocery store before heading home. He pushed a cart through familiar aisles, calculating prices the same way he always did. Bread, milk, pasta. The ordinary rhythm of responsibility continued. Yet when he reached the checkout line, he found himself staring at nothing for several seconds. Not because he was angry, because he had allowed himself to hope. Back at home, another reminder waited. The utility bill had arrived. Higher than expected. Caleb noticed the tension immediately. Did something happen? He asked. Ethan smiled gently. Just one of those weeks. Caleb nodded, though he clearly understood more than his father realized. The next few days became increasingly difficult. Funding cuts at the nonprofit accelerated. Several programs faced cancellation. Families Ethan worked with every week worried about losing support services. Meanwhile, Charlotte faced criticism inside her company. Rumors spread that her judgment had been compromised by personal feelings. She defended her decisions professionally, but each conversation left her more exhausted. For the first time in years, she felt powerless. One Saturday morning, Ethan volunteered at a church parking lot food distribution event despite everything happening around him. Rain drizzled steadily as volunteers loaded boxes into vehicles. An elderly man arrived looking overwhelmed after losing temporary housing. Ethan spent nearly an hour helping him connect with local resources. He never mentioned his own problems. Charlotte happened to arrive midway through the event. She watched from a distance as Ethan gave away his time, energy, and attention when he had every reason to focus on himself. The sight broke something open inside her. Later, standing beside his pickup truck as volunteers packed up tables, she finally asked the question she had been carrying. How do you keep doing this? Ethan looked genuinely confused. Doing what? Showing up when life keeps taking things away. He thought for a moment. Rain tapped softly against the truck roof. Because somebody still needs help. Charlotte felt tears threaten. She turned away before he could notice. Yet even as she admired him more deeply than ever, everything seemed to be falling apart. The job opportunity was gone. The board had drawn a line. Financial pressure was growing, and neither of them could see a path forward. That night, Charlotte sat alone in her office long after everyone else had left. On her desk lay Daniel's letter. Beside it sat a proposal she had never shown anyone. As she reread both documents, a new idea began to form. Risky, unconventional, possibly career-changing. And by sunrise, she would have to decide whether she was willing to stake everything on the kind of man Ethan had always been. By sunrise, Charlotte Bennett had made her decision. The proposal sitting on her desk was not another corporate position. It was something entirely different, something the board could not easily dismiss. For months, the company had been searching for a meaningful way to expand its community impact beyond quarterly reports and public relations campaigns. Charlotte had finally realized the answer was not hidden inside a conference room. It was standing in a pickup truck at church food drives, helping strangers carry groceries and treating every person with dignity. 3 days later, she requested a special board session. The atmosphere inside the downtown Columbus conference room felt tense from the beginning. Several directors expected another argument about Ethan Walker. Instead, Charlotte presented a comprehensive plan for an independent community partnership foundation funded jointly by the company and local donors. The foundation would focus on affordable housing support, family resource programs, and direct neighborhood engagement. Then she revealed the most important part. Leadership would not be based on corporate titles. It would be based on proven trust within the community. Some board members immediately objected. Others asked difficult questions. Charlotte listened carefully before sharing something she had never intended to discuss publicly. She told them about Daniel's letter. She told them about the hospital waiting room. She told them about a man who gave away nearly everything he had because another family needed help. Then she presented testimonials from residents, nonprofit leaders, church volunteers, and families Ethan had quietly helped over the years. Story after story painted the same picture. Not a perfect man, a dependable one, not someone chasing recognition, someone earning trust. The room gradually fell silent. For the first time, the conversation shifted away from credentials and toward character. Meanwhile, Ethan spent the morning repairing a broken wheelchair ramp outside an apartment building. He had no idea any of this was happening. His biggest concern remained the same as always, making sure people were safe and cared for. Later that afternoon, he stopped by the mailbox and found another utility bill waiting. He smiled faintly and carried it inside. Life remained ordinary. That evening, Charlotte arrived at his house again. This time she was not carrying cleaning supplies or old letters. She was carrying a folder. Caleb answered the door first and immediately sensed something important was happening. They sat together around the same kitchen table where everything had begun. Charlotte explained the foundation, the board meeting, the community support. Then she slid the folder toward Ethan. Inside was an invitation to become the founding director of the new initiative. Ethan stared at the pages in disbelief. "Charlotte, I am not qualified for something like this." She smiled through tears. "That is exactly what everyone keeps saying." He looked confused. Charlotte leaned forward. "The problem is that they keep measuring qualifications by what is written on paper. I measure them by what people become after meeting you." The room grew quiet. Caleb looked proudly at his father. Ethan lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by a level of recognition he had never sought. Yet the emotional justice arrived through something even more meaningful than the offer itself. Attached to the proposal were dozens of handwritten letters. Families he had helped, seniors he had assisted, neighbors he had encouraged, children he had mentored. Many of them described moments Ethan barely remembered because he never considered them extraordinary. One letter simply read, "You treated me like I mattered when I felt invisible." Ethan sat silently for several minutes. Not because he wanted praise, because he never realized how far kindness had traveled after leaving his hands. Several months later, the foundation opened its first community resource center. It occupied a renovated building near one of the neighborhoods Ethan had served for years. Families came for housing guidance, education support, and practical assistance. The work was demanding, but it was exactly where he belonged. On opening day, local residents filled the parking lot. Volunteers carried boxes. Children ran between tables. Church leaders, nonprofit workers, and community members gathered together. Charlotte stood beside Ethan as the doors officially opened. Neither spoke for a moment. They simply watched people helping people, the way it should be. Later that evening, after the crowd dispersed, Ethan climbed into his pickup truck while the setting sun painted the sky gold. Charlotte stood beside the driver's door. "Daniel would be proud of you," she said softly. Ethan smiled and looked toward the building. "He helped build this too." Charlotte nodded. For years, she believed success came from climbing higher. Ethan had taught her something different. Sometimes the strongest people are the ones who quietly lift others along the way. As the last light faded and neighbors waved goodbye from the parking lot, both of them understood the truth that had been waiting at the heart of the story all along. Respect cannot be purchased. Dignity cannot be manufactured. And the smallest acts of kindness, offered without expectation, often become the foundation upon which entire lives are rebuilt. In the end, Ethan Walker did not receive recognition because he asked for it. He received it because he spent years giving it away.